listening to Jazz Loft.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our continued day 2 of the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. It's so good that you're here and continuing to be here and full of that good Bocas energy. Thanks for spending the day and indeed the weekend with us. It's my pleasure to introduce a very special one-on-one session. If you have anything to do with rhyme, rhythm, dub, protest, rebellion, love, or music in poetry, chances are at the end of that long, sonorous thread is something you've heard Linton Kwesi Johnson perform or write. It's a true honor to have him here with us today. Please give him a round of applause. Linton will be in conversation with the eminent Chief Fiction Judge of this year's 2023 OCM Bocas Prize, Ronald Cummings. A special shout out to all of you who are viewing and commenting on our live stream. Without further ado, over to the gentleman.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this special session. I'm really excited to be in conversation with you, Linton. In terms of how we'll proceed, we'll open with Linton reading a bit from the work, and then we'll talk about the work together, and then we'll open it up to a wider conversation with you, the audience. So without further ado, Linton is going to read from Time Come.
Microphone check 1 2. This is an extract from an essay. Well, it's not really an essay, it's a lecture I gave at Leeds University some years ago, the Arthur Ravenscroft lecture, titled Writing Reggae, Politics, Poetry, and Popular Culture. So I'm just going to read the last section of it, because it's quite long. I have said before that I came to poetry through politics. As a teenager in the late 60s, I was swept along in the tidal wave of black consciousness that came in the wake of the civil rights movement in the USA. I joined the British Black Panther movement and discovered black literature. Discovering books written by black authors about black people was a revelation to me because nothing in my schooling in the UK had given me the slightest hint that such a body of writing existed. I am a slow reader, but I read as avidly as I could history, politics, philosophy, and creative writing. I didn't understand a lot of what I read, but one book in particular left a deep and lasting impression on me. The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. One sentence that registered on my consciousness was when he wrote about the problem of the 20th century being about the problem of the color line. Du Bois wrote movingly about the shadow of the veil that blighted black life in the USA. What I found amazing about this was that Du Bois was making those observations at the dawning of the 20th century. Moreover, although Du Bois had written about the experiences of African Americans in the immediate post-emancipation period, I could relate what I read to my own experience. The Souls of Black Folk changed my life. It awakened something within me, and I felt an urgent need to express myself, to articulate my thoughts and feelings about the black experience in Britain. That is how my engagement with poetry began. One of the first book of poems I read was a thin volume of African American poetry simply titled Black Poetry. The 25 poets featured included Arna Botem, Gwendolyn Brooks, County Cullen, Langston Hughes, Leroy Jones, a.k.a. Amiri Baraka, Claude McKay, Sonia Sanchez, Don L. Lee, and Margaret Walker. I was immediately struck by the range of style, form, language, and themes, from the sonnets of McKay and County Cullen, the lyrical elegance of Jean Toomer, Dudley Randall's wit, Brooks's powerful call to action, Jones's unusual diction, and Lee's hip street language. Black poetry whetted my appetite for poetry and set me on a journey of discovery. In the Black Panther movement, I had a chance to hear recordings of the last poets who, like Lee, used the everyday language of black Americans as the vehicle of their poetic discourse accompanied by drums. Then I found out about New Beacon Books, Britain's first black publishing house and bookshop. I had no idea at the time that New Beacon was the source of most of the black literature that I found in the Panthers. The bookshop was located in the front room of its founders, John LaRose and Sarah White, in Finsbury Park. My first visit to the shop lasted an entire afternoon, most of which was spent talking to John LaRose, one of the most remarkable people I've ever met. Through him, I got to meet Andrew Salkey, the Jamaican poet, novelist, and broadcaster. They both became my mentors and introduced me to a whole range of literature, including poetry by Amy Césaire, Kamau Brathwaite, Okot Bibtek, Christopher Okigbot, Chikaya Yotamsi, Derek Walcott, Martin Carter, and Bongo Jerry, as well as literary journals from the Caribbean like BIM and Savaco. In 1966, Brathwaite, LaRose, and Salkey founded the Caribbean Artist Movement, CAM, a unique coming together of Caribbean writers, visual and performing artists, and intellectuals whose impact continues to reverberate in Britain and the Caribbean. I caught the tail end of the movement in the early 70s. I consider myself a beneficiary of CAM's legacy. I am what the cooling embers of the movement spawned. In the preface to her book on the Caribbean Artist Movement, Anne Walmsley rights of the organization's aims and objectives. They sought to discover their own aesthetic and to chart new directions for their arts and culture, to become acquainted with their history, to rehabilitate their Amerindian inheritance, and to reinstate their African roots, to re-establish links with the folk through incorporating the people's language and musical rhythms in Caribbean literature, to reassert their own tradition in the face of a dominant tradition, unquote. I recall attending CAM events at the Keskedi Center in North London, meeting or just seeing people like Wilson Harris, George Lamin, Sam Selvon, painters like Errol Lloyd, Aubrey Williams, and sculptor Ronald Moody. It was around that time that I met Eric and Jessica Huntley, whose small black publishing house, Bogle Overture, who later published my second book of poems, Dread, Beat, and Blood, when no one else would. Through the literary journals BIM and Savaku, I was able to get a sense of what was being written in English, in the English-speaking Caribbean, and the critical response. Savaku was the journal of CAM, and I would look forward to getting a copy from New Beacon. Savaku 3-4, a special issue of new writing, much of which reflected the new black consciousness of the time, had a tremendous impact on me. 2 poems by Bongo Jerry, Sooner or Later and Mabrak, captured my imagination, perhaps because I had heard Andrew Salke recite them before. Savaku 3-4 was not well received in some quarters. The poet Eric Roach from Trinidad and Tobago wrote an article attacking the contents for its emphasis on blackness, singling out Bongo Jerry's poems. Gordon Rollier's spirited reply to Roach in 2 articles, West Indian Poetry, Some Problems of Assessment, and Afterthoughts, both published in BIM, have endeared me to his literary criticism. A year or 2 later came Salke's Anthology of Caribbean Poetry, Breaklight, where I read for the first time a poem by Louise Bennett called Colonization in Reverse. Other poems from that book which stuck in my mind were The Song of the Banana Man by Evan Jones and Martin Carter's Poems of Shape and Motion, Tony McNeil's Ode to Brother Joe, Dennis Scott's Uncle Time, and Mervyn Morris's The Early Rebels. By 1972, let me skip that bit. My Black Panther experience had given me a solid political grounding. We had studied Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery, W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America, C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins, E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class, and Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, and bits of Marx, Lenin, and Mao. I was now in a better position to locate myself in the world. Finding out about CAM could not have happened at a more crucial stage of my quest for self-discovery. Then I came across a recording by Count Ozzy and the Mystical Revelation of Rastafari called Groundation, a 3-album set of Rasta drumming, singing, poetry, and oratory on black history. Groundation blew my mind. I began to adopt the external trappings of the Rasta youth. I stopped eating pork and tried unsuccessfully to grow dreadlocks. I embraced Rastafari but refused to call myself a Rasta because I could not accept the divinity of Emperor Haile Selassie. Neither could I reconcile myself to the notion of repatriation as a viable or even desirable political project. I had already rejected Christianity and Islam because of their complicity in the enslavement and colonization of black people. But there was something about the spirituality of Rastafari, its anti-colonial stance, and its alternative worldview that I found alluring. Soon done.
Take your time.
Blah, 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 blah. I teamed up with a group of drummers I had been to school with who were learning the art of Nyabingi drumming. They call themselves Rasta Love. And I would improvise and chant my verse accompanied by them. I wrote Voices of the Living and the Dead for voices, drums, and dancers, and it was staged at the Keskedi Center in 1973, directed by the Jamaican poet and novelist Lindsay Barrett. Prior to that, I had been writing in English, imitating whoever I happened to be reading at the time without proper absorption. Then I started to experiment with language, rhythm, and form using Jamaican Creole. Having no grounding in poetry, I started with a clean slate, improvising, inventing, and learning my craft as I went along. For a while, I felt that my lack of formal training in the art of writing verse was a disadvantage. I was disabused of that notion by Sam Selvon, who insisted that the opposite was true. Selvon told me that starting with a clean slate allowed for the possibility of originality and cautioned against listening to too much talk about proper poetry. In the end, I opted mostly for the language I was most comfortable with and confident in, my first language, Jamaican Creole, or what Brathwaite calls nation language. I made other choices too. I wanted to write poetry that was accessible to those whose experience I was writing about, namely the black community. I wanted to write verse that was relevant, that people could relate to their everyday experience. I wanted to write oral poetry that could hold the interests of the reader as well as the listener. I heard music in language, and I wanted to write word music. Verse anchored by the one-drop beat of reggae, with meter measured by the bass line or the drum pattern. Having made these choices, I embarked on my long apprenticeship in search of this elusive thing called poetry.
Thank you so much for that, Linton. One of the things that you said yesterday when we had a brief chance to chat was that many of the pieces in this book were written by a younger man. This book collects writings from the 1970s to the 2000s, almost 4 decades. I wonder if you might talk about what it's been like coming back to this work, coming back to some of the earlier pieces, for instance, and were there things that you perhaps were tempted to edit, revisit, and also what it's been like, sort of like in occasions like this, perhaps having to revisit some of those pieces in terms of reading them.
Well, the first thing I would like to say is that I would like to disassociate myself from this book. I had nothing to do with it. I was talking to my wife, and I said to her, my wife's name is Shamila Beesmone. I said to her, listen, I'm getting old. When I'm dead, I've got these bits and pieces of stuff I've written over the years. Perhaps you would like to put them together and, for a posthumous publication. And she said, Don't be an idiot. What you talking about? What's the point of that? Time come. And she said, I'm going to put together a book now. And I just let her get on with it.
Well, we're quite...
Well, looking back at some of those things I wrote in my youth, a little bit embarrassing. Some of it I find a little bit embarrassing. And I think I read stuff that I'd written, and I think, well, you were really full of yourself back in those days, weren't you? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, give thanks to Sharmila. We're really lucky to have this book. The book is subtitled Selected Prose, and that in a kind of way functions as a kind of catch-all for a lot of things. One of the things that I found as a reader was the sort of delightful way in which the book unfolded itself to me. You know, like here, there are speeches, there are interviews, there are reviews, there are essays, there are magazine articles. There are so many things, you know, that are contained in this book. And maybe we can talk about some of these, but I want to zoom in on the magazine articles because I was really interested in these. And you know, some of these, as Paul Gilroy points out in the introduction, aren't available anywhere else. You know, they were ephemeral things that were published, you know, to intervene in a public space and time. And so a lot of these pieces were written for Race Today. And I wondered if you might talk a little bit about writing for Race Today, about your involvements and connections with Race Today and the significance of that space.
Well, I was a member of the Race Today collective. It was a radical journal edited by famous Trinidadian Darcus Howe. I had known Darcus from the Black Panther movement days. He was a member of the Black Panther movement. And the Race Today collective consisted of ex-Black Panthers and some members of the Black Unity and Freedom Party. Race Today was originally the journal, the magazine of the Institute of Race Relations, part of the establishment. But the librarian, a man named Sivanandan, had a coup d'etat and took it away from Chatham House. And there was some power struggle between the Institute and their sponsors. And anyway, cut a long story short, Darcus Howe liberated Race Today from the Institute and moved to Brixton to a squat and set up a collective around the magazine. And we were a political organization. We didn't just report on the politics of black working class struggle in Britain and what was going on in the Caribbean and so on. We also took part in political activities. We were involved in several campaigns. One of the most famous was the campaign around the New Cross massacre, which happened in January 1981 when 13 young black children were murdered by fascists in an arson attack. And we formed the New Cross Massacre Action Committee and mobilized 20,000 people for a march to Hyde Park called the Black People's Day of Action. Anyway, I was given the opportunity as a member of the collective to, try my hand at writing. And writing, well, my first love was music. So writing about music and literature, it was a way of learning, basically. Writing for me was a way of learning, of making sense of things. I mean, I have a university education, but I'm basically a self-taught person. And writing book reviews, writing about reggae, writing a review of a play or something, I was educating myself.
I love the sort of connections you're drawing between the writing in this book and moments of political activism. Race today, I would say, seems to be having something of a renaissance. And I'm thinking here about the publication of Here to Stay, Here to Fight, the Race Today Reader, which came out probably a year ago. And I see this book as part of this moment that is calling us to return to race today.
Well, it's part of the work that Leila Hassan Howe, Darcus's widow, has been doing around the Darcus Howe legacy campaign. Yeah.
Right, right. But what are the lessons that you think we might learn from, the sort of collective work of race today? What might it teach us in the context of our present?
I don't know. It provides all those race todays. It provides an history of a particular period in the history of the black experience in Britain. Some of the struggles that we fought, how we fought, and the campaigns we waged in our struggles for racial equality and for social justice. It captures those magazines, when they become available, will give people some insight into what was going on in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah. I mean, I hope they become available. One of the things...
I know that the archives are at, I think, Columbia University.
Right, right. One of the things that is interesting about this book is also the decision to include pictures. And for me, that's a kind of archiving that is here. And it includes clippings from different publications, and I really appreciated that attention to history, personal history in terms of your photographs.
I don't have nothing to do with it. It's my wife.
but also the sort of history of these publications, that you were involved in. I wanted to ask you about writing for Melody Maker. So I still want to sit with these magazine articles because I really think that it's great that we have these brought together. So maybe you could say a little bit about what it was like writing for Melody Maker. I mean, I really, really enjoyed those pieces. And part of it was a kind of attention to listening, a kind of attention to the music you were listening to. But also in that is a kind of sense of shaping a public discourse around a music that the British public was excited about at a particular moment. And it seems to me that you were saying, well, if we're going to have an engagement with this, we should have a sort of informed discussion that, attends to aesthetics and artistry. So I wondered if you might talk about the context of writing for Melody Makers.
Well, to be honest with you, I didn't enjoy my time writing for the Melody Maker because the editor used to butcher my pieces, and I got pissed off with it, I only wrote about 4 columns for them, and then I left.
Right.
But reggae music, if it wasn't for reggae music, I wouldn't be sitting down here having the conversation with you that I'm having. Reggae music is crucial to the formation of my poetics, for a start. The lyricism of reggae music. I was not just simply, as a youngster, a youth, an enthusiast, a reggae enthusiast. Reggae was my world, and reggae was crucial, central to the young people in Britain of my generation. Reggae music was the umbilical cord that kept the Jamaican youth of my generation connected to Jamaica and sustained our Jamaican identity. I was a keen student of the music. I wouldn't just party to it and feel nice. I would transcribe the lyrics and try and understand where the lyricists were coming from and try to put the lyrics into some kind of context. And I became a student, a serious student of reggae music. Reggae music provided the nexus for a culture of resistance for the youth of my generation, a resistance to the racism that we experienced in British society. Everything revolved around sound systems and a subculture, an underground culture, if you like, of resistance. And yeah, that's enough on
that. In reading, and maybe this is coming back to the section that you read from, to open this discussion. In reading this book, there is an awareness, certainly from me as a reader, of you situated as part of a community. And much has been said about, kind of the connections to Louise Bennett's work and to Cam. But I think I was struck by the ways in which you were marking connections to what Erna Brodber might call, this continent of Black consciousness. So the ways in which, you were talking about encounters with writers from Africa, Okot Betek's work, and other African writers. And one of the pieces I enjoyed was your review of Showinka's play. Here was I encountering you as a reviewer of drama, a genre that we don't necessarily associate you with, even though you're known for performance.
I didn't write too many of those.
But I wondered if you might talk about, those connections, and some of these are traced in the Peace South Africa connections, those connections between Caribbean writers, Africa, and the particular locus of London as a sort of meeting space for these connections.
Yeah, well, how do I answer that? Africa was important to the youth of my generation. Africa became a part of we had a Pan-Africanist consciousness, which was part of our general political outlook. And when I became interested in literature, John LaRose introduced me to the poetry of Christopher Okigbo. And he was a Nigerian poet who died in the Biafran War. 67, 68, around that time.
Yeah.
And his work had a remarkable impact on me. He was from the Igbo people, and he'd studied classics. And I don't know, there was something magical about his work, which I think was written, some of which was written to be accompanied by music. So there's that connection. And the work of Chikaya Utamsi from the Congo, which I read in translation. And of course, in our politics, we read a lot of books about Africa. I don't know what happened to these books. There was a whole series of books by a historian called Basil Davidson, which were about ancient African civilizations.
Yeah.
All that was a part of our political education and our consciousness and the rest of it. And in our organizations in Black Power organizations consisted of people from the Caribbean as well as African people, and people from the Asian subcontinent, because back in those days, black was a political term. It didn't mean someone simply with a black skin, I don't think I've answered your question properly, but
no, that's a great answer. I mean, maybe as one way of circling back to this is to ask you about the Kiskadee Center. As a particular locus for that kind of work that I'm asking about, and one of the tidbits that Paul Gilroy drops in the introduction is that you were a librarian there. So I wondered if you might talk about that.
Well, I left university in 1976, unemployed. This was a time of industrial strife in England, high unemployment amongst the youth. So I left university, married man with 3 children, no work. And I was working in this factory, assembling filing cabinets. And then I won a C.D. Lewis Fellowship and became writer in residence, the borough of Lambeth in Brixton. And then Oscar Abrahams, who I had known from the days of the Caribbean Artist Movement, who was the founder of the Keskedi Center, which was a multi-purpose art center based in North London, asked me to come and work there I had a long title, educational resources, something. Anyway, my job was to run the library. My job was to set up a library, right. Organize seminars for black teenagers, school children, and deal with some rude boys who frequented the Keskedi Center. The Keskedi Center was a youth club, a theater, a space for artists, painters, and sculptors. And the library, I just went out and got a lot of books that I liked. Most of which were about black history and literature. And I had to learn the Dewey system. I had to teach myself the Dewey system of classification because I didn't know anything about being a librarian. Yeah, the Keskedi was a unique place because there was nowhere else like it at the time. It was the home of black theater. Plays, a lot of plays were put on there by African playwrights, African-American playwrights, and some Caribbean plays, but mostly very few Caribbean plays come into thinking back on it. But most of the leading names amongst the thespians, black thespians in Britain, all of them started out at the Keskedi or had some experience of the Keskedi. And in its dying days, the Caribbean Artist Movement used to have its activities at the Keskedi Center. Before that, they would have things at the West Indian Student Center based in Earl's Court in West London.
Thank you. This will probably be my last question before we open it up to a wider conversation. But I wanted to say that there's a real generosity to this book, and by this I mean that there is so much space that's devoted to talking about other people. So there's that wonderful profile about Dennis Bovell. There's the interview with Carol Phillips, and of course that last section where there are so many tributes and reflections on the work of other people. And that was one of the lovely things about reading this book. I wondered if you might talk about the decision to include these tributes to different people, and maybe we can
I didn't have anything to do with it.
Well, about the process of writing those tributes to these different folks. And maybe we can zero in.
I'm very fortunate to have known some fantastic people.
Yeah.
I am very, very lucky to have been nurtured by people like Mervyn Morris, to have had Andrew Salke and John LaRose as my mentors, to have been given the pat on the back by Sam Selvon. Yeah. I've known some wonderful people, who have helped to shape me and into the person that I've become, and
Yeah. You closed the book with Jean Binter Breeze, which is the most recent piece that's written. I mean, could you say a little bit about Jean?
Jean was my sister. I first met Jean in 1979 or thereabouts, 1980. Well, I'd heard about Jean because she'd done a very thin volume of poems. I can't remember what it was called at the moment. But anyway, I think it was in 1981, 82, 81 or 82. I was in Jamaica researching a radio series that I had on BBC Radio 1 called From Mento to Lover's Rock, a history of Jamaican music, 10 1-hour programs. And during my time off from my research, I was hanging out with some musicians and people, and someone, Muta, sent a message to say that Muta Baruka, that he was recording an album with some people. Word, Sound of Power, or some album like that. And he said he wanted me to give him some ideas for bass lines. I reminded him about that about 20 years later, and he didn't have any recollection, but there you go. Anyway, Jean Binter Breeze was there, and she approached me. She came up to me and she said, "My name is Jean Binter Breeze, and I'm a poet." And I said, "I know, I like some of your work." She said, "Let's do breakfast." And I said, "Wait, this sister you're well forward." Anyway, we didn't do breakfast, but New Beacon Books, Bogle Overture Books, and Race Today Publications, in response, as a cultural response to the uprisings that we had in 1981, it started the International Book Fair of Radical Black and Third World Books. That ran from 1982 to 1995. And I was one of the organizers. And John and I would do the poetry section, because we always had poetry. It wasn't just a marketplace for books. A lot of other things went on, including poetry readings. And I had the opportunity to invite Jean to England in 1985 for the fourth International Book Fair. And she decided to stay in England. She had a British passport because she'd married an Englishman named Breeze. That's where she got the name Breeze from. Anyway, we became good friends. And I recorded an album with her called Tracks, produced by Dennis Bovell and myself. And when we went on tour, you know that I made my career as a reggae musician. Not, you can't make money out of poetry. You're dead for hungry. And I used to take Jean with me on tour in Europe and North America. She was a great personality. I mean, she had a very bubbly personality. It was great to have her in the band. I'll tell you something. Whenever Jean was with us on tour, I could never get the musicians to play quietly on stage. The guitarist said, "Turn me up, turn me up." The keyboard player says, "Turn me up, turn me up." I can't hear myself talking over the music, When Jean came on stage, everybody played soft and nice and quiet, I said, well, if they can do that for Jean, why can't they do that for me? She was lovely. She was lovely. And, Jean was more than a so-called dub poet, Her poetic horizons was much wider than so-called dub poetry. And when she died, I just put together very quickly a little tribute for my website, and that was included. It wasn't. I didn't have enough time to write something considered. It was a quick thing to say, this is what Jean did. These are her books, her recordings, and so on. And my wife decided to include it in the book.
All right, we'll open up the floor for questions. Someone will bring a microphone to you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You've spoken about the importance of reggae and that you began as a reggae musician as a means of making money. I presume you're aware that your wife included in the book your piece about Mikey Smith.
Yes.
Can you tell us who else, what other musicians you were listening to in your early days?
What other?
What other reggae musicians you were listening to in those early days?
Oh, I was listening to all the classical, all the reggae greats. I was listening to Burning Spear, Toots and the Maytals. I was listening to Bob Marley, and Peter Tosh and Bonnie Whaler, because they're all great musicians in their own rights. The Mighty Diamonds, Ken Booth, Delroy Wilson, I was listening to everything.
Hello.
Hi.
Sort of a twofold question. One, if you had an opinion, which I hope you do, on the current state of reggae music now, and from a musical standpoint, but also from a inspiration standpoint in terms of what you were speaking about, where reggae was kind of that unifying thing for you as someone outside of Jamaica. If you were to like imagine yourself as a young person today, if the current reggae music would still be able to do that, in your opinion, not like a, yeah.
Well, you know, reggae music belonged to a particular historical moment in Jamaica's post-colonial history. And it was unique insofar as of all the popular musics of the time, it was the only one that had such an intense social focus on what was going on in Jamaica at the time. It was the voice of the people. It was the only medium through which we got an idea of what ordinary people, working class people, the unemployed, the peasantry, what they were experiencing and what they were thinking. Of course, a lot of reggae music was like all other pop music, was about matters of the heart, you know, boyfriend, girlfriend, love, business, you know. But that was one of its defining characteristics. By the end of the 1980s, reggae music was more or less finished. That generation had become middle-aged, and the new generation was doing something different. The spiritual values of reggae, because Rastafari gave reggae a kind of a spiritual, the ethos of reggae music came from Rastafari. When in the post-Manley period, when Siaga and them came into power, materialism took over, you know, and it was all about the bling. And, you know, the reggae music that's coming out of Jamaica now belongs to a different historical moment. And it's just a few people, you know, Chronics and I can't remember their names. I don't even listen to too much Jamaican music these days because you can't even dance to it, you know. A lot of the stuff coming out of that, I don't even listen to it. I don't even know what they're saying. I can't understand it.
I don't have a question, I have a recommendation. I don't have a question, I have a recommendation.
Recommendation?
All right, so you should listen to Protege.
Who?
Protege.
Oh, Protege, I know Protege.
Janine.
Yeah, they're good.
You know Janine?
Yes, yes.
Kabaka Pyramid, he just got a Grammy and that album is fire.
Yes, yes,
so
true.
I look forward to hearing.
There are the exceptions.
Yeah.
There are the exceptions to the rule.
Thank you. You were just talking about the particular cultural and political moment in Jamaica, and of course you were talking about being in a particular context in the UK in the 80s with the uprisings and so on. And many of us in the UK feel that in some respects we've gone backwards, and I wondered whether you had a perspective on that in terms of what the moment is now in relation to race and racism and politics, and whether you see a particular, or whether you would give a particular call or advice to young campaigners now, like you were in the 80s.
I would not agree with this notion that we have gone backwards. We had to resort to building autonomous organizations, organizing, mobilizing. We had to resort to uprisings, riots, and insurrections in order to integrate ourselves into British society. By the end of the 1980s, the beginning of the 90s, we had achieved that. In 1987, we elected 4 black members of parliament. Bernie Grant, Diane Abbott, Keith Vaz, and Paul Boateng. There are quite a lot of them in, we have a lot of high officials, elected officials, and so on. So it took us about 3 decades or so, but we managed eventually to bring ourselves, John LaRose would say, we're very much inside British society. Whereas when I was a youngster growing up, we were on the periphery of British society. We were treated like third-class citizens, if citizens at all. So I wouldn't, some people, I can't understand how people would say, oh, nothing has changed and we've gone backwards and all this kind of thing. That's just a lot of nonsense. What I would say is that, 5 minutes, all right. What I would say is that we can't expect too much from our elected members of parliament because they're not elected to carry on our struggles for racial equality and social justice. They're there to represent their constituents, some of whom may be black and Asian or whatever. But I only wish that we have sometime, occasionally, 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 of them will speak out on issues to do with racial justice. But I wish that they weren't so reticent about these matters. But I think at the end of the day, the youngsters nowadays, they have different, with new technology and all the rest of it. I mean, back in 1981, we mobilized 20,000 people without smartphones and computers and WhatsApps and all the rest of it. So they have all the technological means to mobilize themselves, but they need to build organizations. I don't know what shape or form the Black Lives Matter movement that we have in England. I don't know what shape it is. They don't have a journal that you can go to and read and so on. But I do think that in order for us to go to take things further, that has to come from mass mobilization outside of, the parliamentary system. We have to mobilize from external forces, have to bring about further change.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. You didn't talk about George Padmore Institute.
Oh, I wasn't asked.
And I wondered what you see as its role in this new form that you're talking about of the 21st century.
Well,
London.
George Padmore Institute?
The George Padmore Institute was the idea of John LaRose. He was our founding chairman. The George Padmore Institute is an archive containing materials relating to those political and cultural struggles that we waged going back, spanning about 70 years or more. And the importance of the George Padmore Institute is that those archives are there available for the younger generation so that they don't have to believe that they need to reinvent the wheel. Is there as a resource to connect the generations. It's there to bridge the gap between generations, and it's an important educational resource, not just for young black youngsters, but for students in general. We get a lot of students coming all the way from the United States of America to use our archives, and from European universities too. So it's there as a resource. It documents all the histories, it documents all the struggles that we fought from the 50s coming right up to, yes, brethren.
Could you give us one last blast? Like you find a studio, do something like 6 pieces, 8 pieces, and give us one last blast.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Stewart, you see this book, Time Come? That is my swan song. I'm 70 years old, I've lived my life, I want to hear some new, younger voices. Yeah. Time come for the youth now. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Well, it's wonderful to have this book. Thanks for this wonderful conversation. Next here will be Jason Allen Pesand and Celia Soriando in conversation.
Thank you.